Yeah, so we have seen those, historical events, so it's all good. But for us, as part of this class, what's the use of those historical events? So that is where we would be more interested in knowing the legacy of those colonial history and what it has uh, for the politics of today in Mexican society. The purpose of history is not just about those past events, but also how are those events affect what we see today, um, um, especially in the context of Mexican politics. So, deriving from Bora, we see that let's look at some of the colonial legacy and imprints to the Mexican politics today and the attitudes it brought over by the Spanish colonialist. So we'll begin as we see that for as Robert Dow mentioned in the we read in the previous weeks, like there are certain core beliefs which shape democracy. Similarly, Bora believes that um, Catholic religion, with its strong sense of hierarchy and the sense of acceptance and acceptance of control, with its strong sense of hierarchy, with its sense of acceptance of control and status quo, goes directly against um, uh, the Protestant work ethics which was brought over in the United States. So we see that even today there is this strong sense of acceptance or control, and there is a clear hierarchy in the Mexican society, which goes back to those religious belief, Catholic religious beliefs, which was brought over by the Spanish. I mean, we are going to get back to this discussion later, but in brief, but in the case of Mexico today, they do not push so much for their own rights because they should not, because of this belief that they should not question the authority, which comes from those Catholic religious beliefs. Um, they tend to follow the leaders the because of this strong hierarchy and not to question and also related to that is the notion of maintaining status quo. So all these uh, beliefs come from the idea of Catholicism, which got ingrained into the Mexican society, which was introduced by the Spanish colonialist, which we see even today. The second aspect is tenet is the idea of enlightenment, which again, which was brought by the Spanish colonialist. The idea is that men are flawed and there is always scope for improvement, and there is always chance for improvement to better themselves, to push for reforms, and there are a lot of reforms and revolutions in Mexico which reflect this idea of enlightenment. This is where there is a bit of contradiction between the first tenet of maintaining control and status quo on the one hand, and then you have this enlightenment, push for reforms, which the colonialists brought with them to the Mexican society to seek more reforms. So there is this, one this contradiction. On the one hand, you have this status quo, and on the other hand, you have this notion of like reforms, seeking change. Um, I tend to see those contradictions, and I not agree with those two things. Ma- One of the cases that it has been proved that colonies tend to be vetted more towards religious belief than the home countries, whereas the home countries have gone through modernization change, and the colonies still tend to hold on to those traditional beliefs. For example, in the case of Mexico, it is far more religious than the Spain today, and this is where those contradiction comes into the picture. Where, yeah, the colonies brought in the religion, along with it the acceptance of control and status quo, but at the same time they also brought in the idea of enlightenment. So moving on, the another important imprint which we see today is the idea and ideology of superiority of Europe and European ideology. If you look at the Mexican politics and the people who are in power, we see the name. Most of the names are Spanish or European names. We do not get to see any Aboriginals' name. It appears that Aboriginal culture has not come forward, and it has been relegated to the backside. Um, the same is true with the U.S. society, where we speak English language, we study European history after colonization, and we hardly study about the native population history and their culture. And I also mentioned in the class, it's even worse in the case of Canada, where the very definition of native is like anybody who is white or anybody who is born in Canada is considered native. So if you ask a Canadian, uh, uh, are you a native? And they might say, yes, I'm native because I'm born here. So you see those things, they don't, the definition of native is getting diluted. Anyway, but here in this context of Mexico, you see that the superiority of ideas and ideology of Europe. That's one other colonial legacy that we get to colonial legacy imprints that we get to see in Mexico today. The another aspect which uh, we see is this patron-client relationship. So what's patron-client relationship? So if you see in certain European society, people tend to feel like trusting more of a agencies of some sort, like lawyers, business owners, or powerful people, than trusting themselves or the government directly. So they don't, if they have any um, issue or problem, they don't go directly to the government or government agency or trust themselves. Instead, they go through some lawyer, some business owners, or some important person, because they feel going through them they get treated better. This is reflected in politics in Mexico, where those who are powerless won't push for power themselves. Instead, they go through their boss at the workplace, or union leaders, or plantation owners, um, uh, to let those people run things and let those to speak politically on behalf of them, instead of they themselves having the faith in their own ability to change things. So they go through these various patterns, like let it be it a boss at the workplace or union leaders or plantation workers. So you see that patron-client relationship being seen in Mexican society even to this today. And the another important point, maybe this might be useful for people who are interested in law. They brought in this civil code, which is different from the common law. In the European, in the legal tradition of European continent, you see there is a British system who have a common law concept, which is different from the other Western European countries like France, Germany, and Spain, who have what we call civil code. So civil code is a system where laws are passed through legislature and lawyers do not have power to change law through individual cases. You see that even in the case of US history or US legal history, we see many important cases which have changed the policies. But in the case of civil court countries, you don't have that option, and it is through legislature. And the Bora argues that, here is another example where countries with civil law, people do not push for changes because they are used to system where you already have things set in place, and you need not have to do anything to push for changes. And these are some of the colonial legacy imprints of Spain on Mexico, not just in the past, but we see these imprints uh, on politics of today's Mexico. So those are some of the uh, colonial legacy imprints which we saw in Bora's reading. Now let's go a little bit into the uh, Mexican history since colonization. As I was pointing out, um, we also mentioned in the class on Monday. We'll go into the Mexico packet, which deals with the Mexican history since colonization. As with the case with the UK, we are not going fully detailed into the history. We are just briefly touching the main points in the history of Mexico. So we'll start with uh, early 1800s when Mexico became independent uh, with the independence movement led by this priest Hidalgo. Even though Mexico was a colony since then on Cortes since 1519, it was in the early 1800s that it became independent with uh, ordained priest called Hidalgo who leads the independence movement. Um, and this is some kind of people might question, according to Bora and Dal, religious beliefs make you passive, and but here is an instance where religions, in this case the priest, leading the revolutions for independence, so and also not hesitant to be uh, not afraid of being violent for the cause of revolution, for the cause of independence. So we see Hidalgo leading the Mexico towards independence. That's the first important moment in Mexican history since colonization.